we're dealing with Tales of the Round Table.
Yes, sir.
What we're talking about for purposes of your goals, you sent to me already, and you were really explicit about them. Let me see if I can say it right so you can tell that I get it or correct me. One, we're talking about introduction. We're teaching people, hey, look, there's a thing called role-playing. Second, to introduce it in such a way so that it is, okay, well, it's not the equivalent of this. Okay, say a person is into comics and another person has no idea even like how to pick up and read a comic. I mean, they know there are comic books, but they have never conceived of themselves maybe. Then they heard they're cool, and so they're like, got any good comics? Right. Well, in the past, the typical thing that a person would do is seize the most superhero-y of the most superhero-y comic possible and shove it under that person's nose and say, this is it, this is it. Often the person is completely baffled by the idiom of superheroes in comics and has no idea what they're looking at and says, this is obviously deranged, and gives up on the whole thing. And so the point being that to introduce somebody to comics as a medium, you don't simply pick up the most subculturally fixed of its particular idioms, right? So that's why you're not saying, well, here, I'll just give them D&D 5th edition. That'll do it, right? And so that's what you're doing. You're trying to say, look, I'm going to introduce you to the medium of role-playing, and this is an example, and not get distracted by the content that everybody seems to say is role-playing.
Correct.
Right, so that's one thing. And I assume that the rounds table context is part of that accessibility, that the people in question have at least some cultural, like everybody basically has some cultural grasp of, well, there was a King Arthur guy and he's legendary, and a few tropes have sort of trickled through in one fashion or another, probably through movies, but they're there. Everyone knows the name Merlin and stuff. So, okay. With that, and then a lot of other people know a lot more, probably filtered through fantasy fiction, but they know a lot more. Okay, so that's two parts of the accessibility. The other is that it is pick up and play. You, as we've talked about before, as I recently talked about in one of the patron videos, the desire to have a role-playing game that has the accessibility, the physical familiarity and accessibility of, here we go. This is actually, there we go, yes. One of my favorite little, just strategic card games, competitive card games, right? It's called Condottieri. And so you pick it up, and it feels like a box with things in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And here's its little pamphlet. Here's a little board. And then in it there are some cards. And then in a little pocket there, I'm not going to dig it out, there's a little cellophane bag with some pawns and stuff in it.
Sure.
And so the idea is that, you hand somebody this object, and they're not exactly, they're going to, it's got like and then you put it back together, it all fits together, right? It's got, this little packagey thing going on. And there are many attempts at doing this for role-playing. We can sort of break them into big, so it's an impressive box, or small, which is a carryable box. And there's, a bunch. People have tried.
Actually, this might be valuable. Mm-hmm. To see the mock-ups that we've been working with. And I was going to take pictures and blah, 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 but whatever. So you tell me if this is coming through.
No, it's coming through perfectly. Right. Uh-huh.
Use card. Mm-hmm. And then that's your role.
Yeah.
I'm Arthur. Here are my problems. Everybody has one of these. You go through the numbers on the right, and you're done. I didn't even want to have a rule book.
Right.
Just pick up the cards, start reading the cards.
Let's see. Under the Bed is like that. That was the first attempt at a role-playing game that I saw that did that. Where basically you got cards, and a few of them were rules cards, and use cards of one sort or another, and the rest were just the cards that you used.
Sure.
Now, I'm going to say that it has proven, if not to be, no pun intended, a holy grail, that it has proven to be more difficult than people thought. It seemed like it would be sensible, but it's been difficult. But I'm sort of like ticking off the accessibility boxes, right, at this point. And the other thing, too, that makes it this sort of introductory thing is that you're a lot like we did with Cold Soldier. You sit down and you do it.
Yes.
And the whole notion of, well, it goes on forever and it'll be fun in 6 months, right? We're just not doing that, right?
No.
And so many of the various things that we associate with that, which is, your character gets better and better in a very slow way and all kinds of stuff like that, are out. And the idea being, here, I'll show you. So let's sit down. Okay, do this. Here's your card. Here's your card. Are you familiar with Montsegur
No.
by Frederick Jensen? Montsegur is a game that I think you would appreciate very greatly and comes the closest to what you're talking about. It has to do with the last stand of one of the kookier forms of Cathar, dealing with the Inquisition. Historically speaking, it all ends badly. They're all burned alive in history. But it is a castle where some of the holdouts of this beleaguered sect are holed up as the forces move in. And you get little character cards. You get, so you have a picture and you've got some stuff on the back. And you've got an interesting sequence of how plot develops through speaking. After this person goes, then there's a method to determine who gets to go next. There's a little layout that you put the cards on, and they work their way up along the layout. What's sort of important is that you let the relationships, a bit like your situation, you have a lot of openness in terms of how the relationships among the characters develop. They have some pretty trenchant, fixed relationships. The Cathars are supposed to be a celibate sect, and yet, obviously, there's one or two sort of under-the-cover things going on that nobody's supposed to be talking about or know about. So those are just the more obvious of the various personal ties and stuff that have gone on. And as you go along, those develop very freely. The reason I'm bringing it up is because it does a fairly good job of working through the kinds of dynamics that you're talking about and may be worth looking at. And I'm bringing up one of the things that I think is the most important about it. There is a moral choice at the end for each character to concede to the Inquisition, renounce their heretical faith, and live. Otherwise, burn. And what you often find is that it doesn't always match up to whoever stuck by the faith in technical terms isn't always the same people as those who choose not to concede. So anyway, it's a fairly telling drama that develops. So there's sort of a climactic thing. So you can see there's some structural elements. It's the thing I thought of first. Now, one of the things that is a little bit harder for Montsegur, and I like this aspect of it, is its immense historicity. Sure. You actually have to tell people, well, you see, there are these Cathars, and you can easily go down a rabbit hole there. And you can also easily kind of bounce off it. A person says, what? I don't want to play some freaking, weird fanatic who won't have sex. What's that? So you can have, it can be accessible or not. It's kind of a toss-up. Whereas your situation is more accessible in terms of raw pickup. In other words, you're not even sticking with a particular Arthurian legend. You're not
part
even,
of the point is that there is no singular monolithic Arthurian version.
No, there's dozens. They're all scattered
Exactly.
everywhere. Yeah. To stick with the whole accessibility thing, is that although there's no textual authoritative Arthur thing, we are somewhat cursed by the by its cinematic presence. And the example is the Sword in the Stone.
Yeah.
And everything else that has ever been made for any age group has been a spin on Disney's The Sword in the Stone back in the day. And so pretty much every Arthurian thing since then, whether it's got, boobs or not, has been sort of a take on that. So what I'm saying, though, is this. Would you consider getting a little weird with it so that we're talking about, for example, a galactic civilization with, humanoids, and it's clear who they are. But the reason I'm saying this, and this is not a suggestion, this is a food for thought thing, because we're talking about the accessibility. What I'm talking about is the accessibility for plot. Not accessibility to pick up, but accessibility to plot, to develop on its own. Do you see what I mean? Calling them Arthur and Guinevere. Everybody knows Arthur and Guinevere are going to get together. Everybody knows there's going to be a war and this is going to happen. Arthur will win. And so the question is, you pick up the Arthur stuff, and to stop yourself at these conflicts that you've got on the cards without equally adopting their outcomes as you know of them is kind of hard. In other words, it's the open-endedness of the play itself, which is what you're teaching. You're teaching that it can go any which way, and that your decisions have mechanical consequences, and there are random factors as well, and you have to kind of ride those waves and see how it turns out. But without your decisions and your role-playing going into it, it's not going to happen. So it's again, if you say my job here is to play Arthur in a kind of actor sense, the climax is written. My job is to play Guinevere, and if you're thinking like an actor, you know the end of the story.
How I've kind of been pitching it to people is I tell them the color, of course, to start, but then I say, but it's emergent. You don't know what's going to happen. It could be Arthur and Guinevere get married and live happily ever after. Could be Arthur goes bad, Merlin becomes queen. Right. You don't know. And then people's eyes kind of light up.
That's the important point I wanted to ask you about. And I mentioned the whole alien thing as kind of the edge case of if you said, all right, I keep trying and it keeps turning out the same way every time. Or I have X number of people just driving at the classic story every single time, and there's nothing I can do about it, then maybe it's time to think about lemon-colored aliens, in these roles.
Sure.
And so that's what I'm asking you about, since you've been playtesting it, and the obvious question is, what's the diversity of outcomes?
The diversity of outcomes has been... Well, I'm really happy with how much the dice mechanic, the fortune is really deterministic for what goes on. People drive at what they want in this scene. They want to soften this character's heart. They want to accomplish this goal. They make their cases. The muses judge. And then the roll happens. And, of course, if the protagonist fails, he or she gets a thorn in his or her heart, starts to affect their behavior. And then by Act 3, you must act in accordance with your thorn in some manner. We had a session where Merlin's thorn was impatience. Everything was going wrong. And so he just, when his turn came around, he said, I just leap up and stab Edmund in the back. We don't have time for a war. And so there has been a diversity of outcomes. And
let me say I want to work with that. Because one of the things I wanted to ask about was, what capacity is there and what capacity have you seen in play for people to have their characters do things besides just wait their turn to talk and then pick a move as written and then do the move. Let me put it this way. If we took each, let's take one of the turns, 1, 2, or 3, I don't care which one, and we looked at the available goals that you might pursue. And then we looked at the available roles that proceed from that. And we look at the available thorns that may proceed from that, in the lose side of it, like a flowchart, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, there is such a thing as that flowchart being too, well, for lack of a better word, code-oriented.
Right.
If you're writing a Pascal program, you want to make sure that anything that can possibly happen is one of those twigs.
Right.
And that there is no empty set. The coder hates an empty set. That's just, they're like, no, broken. You'll get the blue screen of death if that happens. Sure. And so what I'm trying to say is that that's why coding mentality is very useful in many ways for role-playing, but it only goes so far. So that since there's no move for I stab him in the back, unless I'm mistaken.
Yeah, in Act 3 you can kill people. In Act 1 and 2, no one can die.
Well, so here's my point, though. If you have a Pascal program here, and yes, you have decisions about which fork to take in each given sort of fork, or maybe there's 3 or 4 you could take, but the little tines are there. The little signs are there for you to go this, or this. Pick one. And then the outcomes of them, based on the rolled outcome and whatever, are nice little branching yes-nos in terms of mechanics, right? Now, this runs the risk of having, effectively, you run the program, and the people themselves are basically just acting as dice at each fork about which one to go on, and the dice are acting as dice in their turn when it comes to their particular little fork after that. And that's all there is to it. So that ultimately speaking, you could, although it would be a fairly thick set of, little twigs at the right-hand side of the page, still, it accounts for anything and everything that could occur during play. And you have that sort of coder mentality sense of satisfaction of, okay, good. We've got all the possible outcomes mapped, and we know how each one gets there. We know that there's no redundancy. You can only get to this one through, that way, and we're good. And the problem with that for role-playing is that it turns the role-playing into thespianism. Right. And that the role-playing in and of itself is not particularly, for lack of a better word, it's not particularly open to what does my guide do.